If you walk past 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue this morning, you won't see the stately symbol of American democracy. You'll see a disaster zone dressed up in patriotic landscaping. You'll see a mud-filled crater where the East Wing used to stand. You'll see silent yellow cranes towering over the executive mansion like vultures. And you'll hear something that feels wrong on White House grounds. Not cheers, not chanting, not even the steady grind of progress, just the eerie pause of a project that's become a national argument. Because as late January 2026 closes in, President Trump's controversial White House ballroom plan isn't just a construction project anymore. It's a courtroom fight, a donor mystery, a security headache, and a political metaphor so on the nose it barely needs narration. The president calls it too late to stop. Preservationists call it a legal end run. And a federal judge is now weighing whether the administration can keep moving forward, or whether this grand ballroom becomes the most expensive hole in the ground in modern American politics. Let's be clear about what's real and what's rhetorical. The East Wing is already gone. The lawsuit is real. The judge is real. The stakes are real. What's not settled yet is the one thing that makes this story combustible. Whether the courts will force the White House to hit the brakes before this turns from demolition into irreversible new construction. And in a presidency built on the idea that momentum is power, a forced pause is a kind of humiliation. So in this deep dive special report, we're going to walk through the legal fight that's now hovering over the crater. We're going to explain how the East Wing demolition became a political boomerang. We're going to talk about the private money promise that keeps getting repeated while the public is still asking, okay, but where is it? And we're going to show why the stalled visuals outside the residence are the perfect symbol for a second-term brand that can't afford, even emotionally, to look unfinished. The king wanted a castle. He may end up with a fenced-off pit and a stack of court filings. To understand why Washington has been watching this like a slow-motion collision, you have to rewind to late 2025. Fresh off returning to power, President Trump announced what he pitched as the most ambitious modernization of the White House's public event space in generations. A proposed 90,000-square-foot ballroom meant to dwarf the traditional East Room and rival the grand halls of foreign palaces. Higher ceilings, bigger capacity, flashier finishes. In Trump's worldview, scale is legitimacy. If it's bigger, it's better. If it glitters, it wins. The price tag attached to this vision has floated in the hundreds of millions range, commonly framed as $300 to $400 million. And the sales pitch was simple. Taxpayers wouldn't pay a dime. This would be funded privately. A gift. A patriotic donation drive from wealthy backers who wanted to help the country host dignitaries in style. That's the pitch. A charitable crown jewel. But the cost was never just financial. To make room for the ballroom, the administration moved straight to the irreversible part, tearing down the existing East Wing footprint and ripping out adjacent historic elements tied to the public-facing life of the White House. Offices, spaces tied to First Lady operations, visitor flow, and the soft power machinery that makes the place function as more than a house. Once you demolish history, you can't undemolish it. You can only rebuild something else and insist it's equivalent. Preservation groups didn't just complain, they sued. The National Trust for Historic Preservation filed a legal challenge arguing that the administration bypassed required review processes. Environmental, preservation, planning, and oversight mechanisms that normally apply when you alter nationally significant public property. Their core argument is brutally simple. No president gets to treat the White House complex like a personal renovation show with a private sponsorship banner slapped on the end. And that's where the story stops being a construction update and becomes a constitutional-flavored knife fight. In federal court, the question isn't, do you like ballrooms? The question is, who has the legal authority to do this, under what process, and with what kind of oversight? Can the executive branch demolish and rebuild major parts of the White House complex without Congress explicitly signing off? Can it rely on private funding routed through offices under presidential control? Can it begin work that effectively locks in a final design before advisory bodies and public processes have fully weighed in? These are not design preference questions. These are who owns the people's house in practice questions. And the judge presiding over this has not been shy about what he thinks the administration is trying to do. Judge Richard Leon has openly signaled skepticism toward arguments that this is just another routine presidential renovation. He's questioned whether the legal authority being cited actually fits something of this magnitude. He's challenged the idea that you can compare a colossal new structure to minor historic modifications and call it precedent. And he's raised the kind of be serious tone that, in courtroom language, translates to, your spin is not landing. Now here's where the story gets dangerous for Trump politically, because it creates a trap. Trump's whole posture is dominance through inevitability. He doesn't like negotiations. He likes fait accompli. Do the thing first, and then dare people to undo it. That's why the demolition matters so much. Once the East Wing is already rubble, the president gets to say, look, it's done. You can't stop what's already happened. It's the political equivalent of lighting the match and then lecturing everyone about fire safety. But the court is now weighing the exact opposite principle. You don't get to win by rushing. You don't get to manufacture too late as a legal strategy. And if the judge decides that the administration jumped the gun, skipped steps, boxed out oversight, or treated review as an inconvenience, then the president's momentum becomes evidence against him. That's why, even without a dramatic stop-work scene, the project already feels like it's on thin ice. The administration has defended the ballroom as necessary, even pointing to national security-related considerations in the broader rework of White House infrastructure. Critics argue that national security is being used as a rhetorical battering ram. Wave the words security and continuity until everyone stops asking questions about process. But reporting around the case has also highlighted that security professionals can view major construction itself as a risk. Disruption, exposure, changing sightlines, unpredictable vulnerability windows. In other words, you can't automatically shout security and assume it excuses everything, especially if the build creates new problems. And then there's the money. The money is the quiet monster under the whole story. The White House line has leaned heavily on private funding. That's the shield. That's the whole no taxpayer dollars pitch. But private funding raises its own problems: transparency, influence, and optics. If major government contractors, regulated industries, or politically entangled donors are funding a massive addition to the White House complex, the ethical questions write themselves. Are they buying access? Are they buying a legacy plaque? Are they buying favor? Even if every dollar is legal, the public will still ask if the presidency is being sponsored like a stadium. And in a legal fight, where is the money exactly is not just a political question. It can become a procedural one. Because if work continues in ways that presume funding and approvals that aren't finalized, then the project begins to look like it's operating on vibes and bravado, a concept of a check, a plan to have a plan. This is why the visuals are so devastating. Politics is optics, and the optics here are a gift-wrapped nightmare. President Trump is obsessed with presentation. He builds brands, not just buildings. He wants the aura of control, the aura of wealth, the aura of perfection. But right now, the thing sitting next to the residence is not perfection. It is a messy, physical reminder that he started something massive and controversial. And the country is not letting him just declare it complete. Every news stand-up that includes the White House in frame risks catching the cranes. Every long lens shot risks catching the fencing. Every visiting motorcade, every ceremonial arrival, every historic moment backdrop now comes with the subtle suggestion that the place is under renovation. And renovations are fine until they become symbolic of instability, until they start to feel like governance itself is unfinished. And if a court ultimately slows or pauses progress, then the story gets even sharper. Because a paused project doesn't just look unfinished, it looks rejected. Imagine the humiliation of having the most recognizable house in the country visibly stuck between destroyed and rebuilt. Imagine the next state visit, the next photo op, the next carefully staged moment, framed against a site that looks like a contractor walked away mid-job. Not because of weather, because of legality. This is where the Ballroom from Hell nickname, floated by critics, starts to make sense. Not as a supernatural curse, but as a political one. The ballroom becomes a trap because it forces Trump to live with the consequences of his own aesthetic obsession. It turns his signature strengths, speed, force, spectacle, into liabilities. The project is so big it can't be ignored, so controversial it can't be normalized, so physically present it can't be spun away. And it doesn't help that the broader context has been rough. Whether it's global market anxiety, high-profile diplomatic awkwardness, or domestic legal and political turbulence, the last thing any president wants is a permanent, literal reminder outside his window that the administration is in a fight it can't fully control. Even supporters who love the idea of a bigger, better White House don't love the image of chaos around it. They want dominance, not disruption. They want winning, not welding. Now let's talk about the preservation argument because it's the backbone of the legal case and the emotional fuel for the backlash. The White House is not just a workplace. It's a national symbol. It's a historic site. It's held in trust for the public. That's the concept that preservationists keep hammering. Stewardship, not ownership. The president lives there temporarily. The building belongs to the country permanently. The East Wing, in particular, has a layered history. Elements date to early 20th century expansions, and major work in the World War II era is tied to the kind of grim reality that shaped American governance. Wartime urgency, security infrastructure, and the practical needs of a government that suddenly had to think about survival. Over decades, the East Wing became the operational home for the First Lady's staff and functions tied to the public-facing ritual life of the White House. It was not some random disposable annex. It was part of the organism. So when critics say you can't bulldoze it for a bigger dance floor, they're not just complaining about taste. They're arguing that historic integrity is not a cosmetic feature you upgrade when donors feel generous. They're arguing process is the protection. If you can bypass review once, you can bypass it forever. And then the White House becomes whatever the current occupant wants it to be, a personal brand extension instead of a public inheritance. That's why this case matters beyond Trump. Even people who don't care about Trump care about the precedent. If the executive branch can demolish and rebuild major parts of the White House complex without the kind of oversight that would apply to far smaller federal projects, then what exactly are the rules for power? And if the rules are whoever has the nerve, then the next president could do the same thing, and the next, and the next. That's how the people's house becomes a political prop. The administration's defense has leaned on history. Presidents have renovated. Presidents have modified. Presidents have changed rooms, changed layouts, improved security, updated facilities. That's true. But the scale here is what breaks the comparison. This isn't swapping drapes. This isn't adding a pool. This is replacing a major wing footprint with a colossal new structure funded by private money in an era where every donor has an agenda and every agenda has a receipt. And the judge's skepticism matters because it signals the court understands that scale changes the legal question. At some point, renovation stops being maintenance and starts being construction. At some point, executive discretion stops being managerial authority and starts being bypassing the legislature. That's the fault line. So what happens next? In the immediate term, the court fight continues. A ruling on whether to temporarily halt or restrict further work could land soon, with appeals likely either way. Advisory review bodies still loom. Public comment, planning approvals, and design scrutiny remain live issues. Even if the administration ultimately wins the right to proceed, it's not a clean win. It's a win with asterisks, a win with court language, a win that can still look like a political bruise. And if the administration loses, if a judge decides the process was wrong, the approvals were insufficient, or the legal authority doesn't stretch this far, then the nightmare scenario becomes possible. Not just delays, but reversals. Not just tweaks, but requirements to restore, remediate, or halt certain phases until lawful steps are completed. The very thing Trump hates most, being told no in writing by an institution he can't bully. The other variable is money, because money is what turns a vision into concrete. If the public never sees a transparent accounting of where private funding is coming from, the controversy will keep growing. If donors appear to be politically transactional, the ethics story will grow. If market stress or reputational risk makes donors hesitate, the timeline story will grow. And if the project drags into the next political cycle, it becomes a target, because nothing invites retaliation like a half-finished monument to the previous administration's ego. That's the irony here. The ballroom is supposed to be Trump's physical legacy, but physical legacies are fragile when they're built on political sand. A future administration can change priorities. Congress can change oversight posture. Courts can change what's allowed. Donors can change their minds. And permanent becomes temporary, faster than the paint dries. Which brings us back to the image outside the White House today. The crater, the cranes, the fencing, the uneasy quiet. Whether the ballroom eventually rises, or whether the project gets slowed, reshaped, or legally boxed in, the symbol is already out there for the public to interpret. A presidency that wanted to project power has created a visible vulnerability. A presidency that wanted to show control has produced a landscape that looks like uncertainty. A presidency that sells itself as the ultimate builder is now tied to a site that currently looks like demolition without conclusion. The king wanted a castle, and right now he's got a hole in the ground and a court calendar. So yes, watch the filings, watch the approvals, watch the money trail, watch the next hearing dates. Because the next few weeks don't just determine whether a ballroom gets built, they determine whether the White House becomes a precedent. A public trust protected by process, or a personal canvas painted by force. And if this ends with a redesign, a delay, or a forced pause that turns this site into the most famous unfinished project in America, then the ballroom from hell won't be a nickname. It'll be the obituary headline of an ego project that mistook demolition for destiny. Anyway, subscribe, like, share, or don't. The cranes aren't going anywhere.